Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Anatomy and Physiology podcast. What do you guys think about for a name for this thing? KB's A&P podcast. Probably too many letters, huh? Let me know if you can think of a better one. Okay, let's talk about joints today. And joints, sometimes they're called articulations, and these are where two or more bones come together. Um, Joints can be described in two different ways. We can talk about the structural classification of a joint, and that's either a joint being fibrous, cartilaginous, or synovial, and that's where I'm going to spend most of the time talking about that stuff. But I'd also like us to be aware that there's another way that we can classify joints as based on their functionality or their function. And the functional classification of joints are synarthroses, amphiarthroses, and diarthroses. So let's just go over those real quick, and then we'll stick to the structural breakdowns after that. So a synarthrosis or synarthroses, these are going to be joints that are non-movable. These things are basically the two bones that come together are almost fused together, and they allow for no movement. These things we would typically not even think of as being joints. Maybe like the bones between in our skull. Those things, they don't move at all. It's almost like it's one bone, but technically it's two different bones coming together. So it is a joint, and it's a synarthrosis. Synarthroses are synonymous, or they're pretty much the same thing as fibrous joints. Amphiarthroses, these ones have a tiny bit of movement. There's a little bit of movement in amphiarthroses, and these ones are going to be synonymous with our cartilaginous joints. So there's usually cartilage in between them, and they can flex and bend just a tiny, tiny bit, but there's hardly any movement here. And then finally, diarthroses. These are going to be our joints that are freely movable. These things are what we would typically think of when we think of joints, and they're synonymous with our synovial joints. These are things like our elbows, our wrists, our fingers, our neck, all of the joints that can move around. And just so that we're all on the same page with these functional classifications, here's a breakdown of each word, and maybe that'll help us remember what each one is. So they all have the root word arthro, which means joint, and the prefix it describes how much movement each one of these joints has. So a synarthrosis, the ones that are non-movable, these ones, it's almost like the two bones are fused together or synthesized together into one bone. An amphiarthrosis, amphi means like half and half. These joints are like half synarthrosis, half diarthrosis. They can kind of move a little bit, but they're also kind of non-movable. So amphiarthroses means like half and half. These are our cartilaginous joints. And then finally, diarthroses, the freely movable joints, the synovial joints. Those ones, di means two, and this is where the joint still has two bones left over. Like they can freely move past one another, and they're not fused together. So diarthroses, the two bones are still freely movable. So now let's go into our three major structural classifications of joints: fibrous, cartilaginous, and synovial. And I would like us to know a few examples of each one of these things, and just generally what are they, and then we're going to go into each one of the examples. So fibrous joints, these are joints that are connected by fibrous connective tissue. These ones have these thick fibers that wrap around the bone and sort of fuse the two bones together, and there's basically no movement in these things. A couple of them have a tiny, tiny bit of movement, but I'm totally fine with us saying that fibrous joints have no movement. That's fine with me. And fibrous joints come in three basic styles. We can have sutures, syndesmoses, and gomphoses, and let's go over each one of those. Sutures is a type of fibrous joint where the periosteum of one bone is sort of continuous with the periosteum of another bone. So basically these exterior fibers, they pretty much grow together and they fuse together. And the only place that we're going to find sutures are between our skull bones. And we've probably named all of these already, but like the coronal suture between the frontal bone and the parietal bone, that's a good example of a suture. A bunch of other sutures in the skull. And that's really the only place we're going to find these things. Next up, our second type of fibrous joint is a syndesmosis. A syndesmosis. And this is where we get these really thick, dense ligaments that wrap around two bones and basically hold them in place. Technically, it's still a joint, even though there's not much movement occurring. This is the one where there's a tiny bit of movement sometimes in these, but again, I'm fine with us saying that all of these fibrous joints basically have no movement to them. Where are we going to find a syndesmosis? Well, the biggest and best one that we can find is between our radius and our ulna. The two bones of our distal arm, our forearm, we have these thick ligaments that wrap around both of them and basically hold them in place. And there's two other smaller joints that allow for these two bones to rotate past one another, and I'll talk about those later in the podcast. But if you grab onto your forearm and try and squeeze these two bones together, they're not going to move because it's a syndesmosis where these thick, fibrous ligaments hold these two bones in place. There's maybe only one other good spot to find these things in the human body, and that's between the tibia and the fibula. And the way I remember syndesmosis, the word kind of has Moses in it. And so if you think of like Moses parting the Red Sea, I imagine him like putting his hands up and then moving his hands apart like he's parting the Red Sea. And he would sort of do that with his forearms a little bit. I don't know if that helps. A syndesmosis between the radius and the ulna. Last but not least, for our fibrous joints, we've got our gomphoses, or one single gomphosis. And these ones are only going to be found in our mandible and maxilla. And these are going to be these specialized joints that are almost like little pegs fitting into a socket. And there's, again, only one place that we're going to find these, and this is going to be in our teeth. So our teeth are technically joints, bone connected to another bone, and these things are called gomphoses. Let's switch it up a little bit. Switch from our fibrous joints that had these dense fibers that are going to connect two bones together, and we'll switch over to cartilaginous joints. And cartilaginous joints, as the name sounds like, these are going to be joints formed by cartilage. There's going to be a bone, some cartilage, and then another bone connected to it. Again, these guys have a tiny bit of movement. They can sort of flex a little bit, but there's not a lot of movement happening here. And cartilaginous joints have two major categories, synchondroses and symphyses. And I'll just get the hard part out of the way immediately. A synchondrosis is a cartilaginous joint formed by hyaline cartilage, whereas a symphysis, these ones are a cartilaginous joint formed by fibrocartilage. So let's go into each one. The synchondrosis. A synchondrosis, the ones that are formed by the hyaline cartilage, where can we find these things? Well, my favorite place to find a synchondrosis is between the ribs and the sternum. You might not even think of that as being a joint, but technically we've got our ribs sort of angling around the thoracic cavity and then meeting up at the most anterior point at that sternum. And there's some hyaline cartilage between the rib and the sternum, and it allows those ribs to flex a little bit. Maybe if you've ever fallen on your side or like fallen on your chest, you might have strained or sprained some of those joints right there, and then it's just sore for a couple of days. That's a good example of a synchondrosis, a joint formed by hyaline cartilage. Is there any other good examples? Well, I mean, I guess a really good example of another synchondrosis is when children are growing, we said that they have these epiphyseal plates in their long bones, where we have a bone, some sort of plate of hyaline cartilage, and then an end or an epiphysis to those long bones, and that's where all the growth happens at that epiphyseal plate. And you might not even think about that as being a joint, but technically it's bone, hyaline cartilage, and then another bone. It's the same bone, but it's broken up with hyaline cartilage, so technically that's another example of a synchondrosis. Symphyses, these ones are the cartilaginous joints formed by fibrocartilage, and again, these have a little bit of movement to them. And a great place to find one of these is the pubic symphysis, which is in between our two pelvic bones, and it meets up at the very anterior point. So there's a little bit of fibrocartilage right there, and that's going to be a good example of a symphysis. Is there any other good ones? I mean, our intervertebral discs, so those big, thick cartilage discs in our vertebrae, in between our vertebrae, those are technically fibrocartilage, and so that could be another example of a symphysis, our intervertebral discs in our vertebrae. And that kind of sums it up for fibrous joints, cartilaginous joints. Now let's jump into the biggest category, synovial joints. These are going to be those freely moving joints, our diarthroses. And it's kind of the biggest category because there's a bunch of different subtypes of synovial joints. Synovial joints are kind of what we would typically think of when we would think of joints. Maybe those other ones that we've covered so far, you might even be thinking to yourself, are those even joints? I mean, technically they are because they're two bones meeting up, but synovial joints are the ones that can bend. And that's what we typically think of when we think of joints. They're the ones that can get sprained. We can maybe crack them if you crack your knuckles or something. Those are the synovial joints we're talking about. So a synovial joint is characterized by having synovial fluid in between the two bones. And it's this little fluid-filled membrane, and it's got some cartilage wrapped around one bone, cartilage wrapped around another bone, and then the joint cavity, or the space between the bones, is filled with this synovial fluid. And what synovial fluid does is it's really, really slippery. And it's formed with this stuff called hyaluronic acid, and it allows for basically almost no friction between these two bones. It's one of the most slipperiest fluids humans can come across. And interestingly, we just mentioned like cracking your knuckles. Cracking our knuckles can occur because of this synovial fluid. And basically what happens is if you push a joint to its most extreme, like you kind of push on your knuckles, it'll create some negative pressure inside of our joints, and it'll release all of the carbon dioxide that is dissolved in the synovial fluid. It'll release it into like a snap. And then if you let your joints sort of hang out for 5, 10, 15 minutes, all of that carbon dioxide will dissolve back into the synovial fluid, and then you can snap your joint again. So that's kind of how a synovial joint works. Let's go over the different types of synovial joints. The ones that I would like us to know about: pivot joints, hinge joints, saddle joints, planar joints, condyloid joints, and then ball and socket joints. So maybe pause the podcast right now, see if you can describe each one of those, and see if you can maybe even come up with one or two examples of each one. But I'll go over them. We'll go over them together here. A planar joint is where two flat surfaces come together with synovial fluid in between them and a little synovial joint capsule, and it allows for these two bones to slide past one another in what's called a gliding movement. Where can we find these things? There's a bunch of them in between our vertebrae. So we have all of these little processes that stick off of our vertebrae, and the two of them articulate together and can kind of slide past one another. Those are good ones. And then maybe the acromial clavicular joint, which is the joint between the acromion of our scapula and the clavicle, and that's sometimes called the AC joint. If you feel the top part of your shoulder, you'll feel this little bump. This little hard knob, and that's where the acromion and the clavicle come together. And there's a little synovial joint there that these two bones can slide past one another. And then maybe all of the intercarpal joints, so all of the joints between the carpals of our wrist, they have these little flat surfaces that can glide past one another. More examples of our planar joints. How about a saddle joint? Saddle joints are really cool. Saddle joints are pretty complex, and they can allow for a huge range of movement because of its structure, its shape. And what the shape looks like is it looks like a saddle with a little rider sitting in its saddle. So there's this like concave surface, like a saddle, and then a convex surface, like a rider sitting in the saddle. And what that allows for is it allows for a bunch of range, a wide degree of movement, and a pretty good structure. And the best place that we're going to find this thing is between metacarpal 1 and the carpal that it articulates with, which is the trapezium. This is basically at the very base of your thumb, where your thumb kind of meets into your hand. And so not really at the where you typically think of the thumb, but it's at the metacarpal to your wrist. And that allows for a really huge range of movement where your thumb can sort of move into your hand, and that movement is called opposition, where you take your thumb and touch each one of your fingers. So without this type of joint right there, our human hands wouldn't be able to function in the way that they do. Where's another good example of a saddle joint? I guess the sternoclavicular joint. So between the sternum and the clavicle, there's a nice little saddle-like structure that the two bones can meet up in, and it allows for the clavicle to protract and retract really easily, as well as elevate and depress too. Okay, let's get into some more fun synovial joints. How about the hinge joint? A hinge joint. This one's pretty straightforward. This is where we have like a cylinder and then a little rounded structure around the cylinder that can move in one direction. And these joints are going to be joints like the elbow is probably the best example of this thing. It's where uh, the ulna sort of wraps around the humerus and can hinge back and forth in one direction. Our knee is not technically a hinge joint, but for this course, I'm totally fine with us saying that the knee is another example of a hinge joint because it fits kind of nicely, right? It's got one degree of movement or one direction of movement. Good example of a hinge joint. I think technically, what are these things called? The knee is called a sesamoid joint, I think, but we can just call it a hinge joint. How about another good one? Okay, between our fingers, so like the proximal, middle, and distal part of our phalanges, those are going to be hinge joints because they only want to move in one direction. If you try and bend them to the side, they really don't want to move that way. Okay, what else? How about pivot joints? Okay, a pivot joint, and if you're a Friends fan, we're all thinking about like pivot. Pivot joints, these are ones where we have a cylinder, but instead of like a hinge joint where there's a surface that wraps straight around it, there's a peg or like a process, a cylinder that has a structure wrapped around it that can allow rotation around that central pivot point. And I think the coolest one of these, well, there's two good ones. How about the between C1 and C2? There's this little dens of the axis of C2, and the atlas can kind of sit right on top of that and can rotate around this tiny cylinder that projects upward. And that's a good example of a pivot joint. But then another really good example might be like the radius and the ulna, and specifically where these two bones can rotate around one another and can sort of rotate, not like our hinge joints do. So it allows for pronation and supination. Okay, we've got two more here. How about our ball and socket joints? This one we're probably familiar with. A ball and socket joint is where we have like a rounded head that fits into a concave socket. This is going to be really prevalent in like our hip. Our femur has this huge head with a tiny little neck on it, and it fits into our pelvis socket, that acetabulum, and it can allow for a huge range of motion. We're talking about flexion and extension, abduction, adduction, circumduction, like a circular movement all the way around. Tons of movement in these ball and socket joints. The shoulder is another good example where the head of the humerus fits into the scapula, that glenoid cavity. Ball and socket joints, I think what I'd like us to know about these is these are the ones that allow for the widest range of movements, but they tend to be susceptible to dislocation because they are so flexible. They allow for so much movement. They can tend to pop right out of their sockets pretty easily. And last but not least, how about the condyloid joints? Condyloid joints, we saved them for last after the ball and socket because condyloid joints are modified ball and sockets where we still have this rounded structure, not quite like the head of a bone, but just a rounded structure with a rounded surface that it fits into, or rounded depression, I should say. So these ones are great because they allow for that wide range of movement like a ball and socket joint has, but it's a little bit more stable. The head can't like snap off of it because it's just a rounded surface. And probably the best place that we're going to find this one is between the occipital bone at the bottom part of the skull and the atlas, so C1. And we get these two rounded surfaces on the occipital bones, and they can fit into a nice depression on C1, and it allows for tons of movement around the neck. Speaking of movements, let's shift and talk about what kind of movements do those synovial joints do they allow. And the reason we want to have a nice nomenclature for describing these movements is so that you can communicate really effectively with our medical colleagues, and we can quickly say, this person's experiencing pain when they supinate their forearms. Instead of saying, yeah, when they turn their wrist so that their palm is facing upward, we have words to describe each one of these movements to make it really simple. So let's go through each one. First and foremost, planar joints. They allow for a movement called a gliding movement. We talked about that a little bit. And again, that is just where the bones sort of slide past one another. Pretty simple. Now let's get into the more complex movements. We have what are called angular movements, and there's a couple of those that I'd like us to know. This is where like the angle of the two bones change as the bones are moving. We have our most basic ones being flexion and extension. Flexion is where we take a joint and we decrease the angle of the joint. So imagine having your arm straight on in front of you. If you bend your elbow to a 90 degrees, we went from 180 degrees to 90 degrees, that's going to be elbow flexion. If I take my bent elbow at 90 degrees and I put it back to 180 degrees, that's going to be extension. Same thing with our knees. If you bend your knee, that's knee flexion. If we put it back to straight 180 degrees, that's knee extension. Let's go with abduction and adduction next. Abduction with a B, some people call it abduction. Abduction is where we're moving things away from the midline. Think about abducting something means you steal it and take it away. Abduction of the leg would be like putting your leg out to the side, away from the midline. And then adduction, adduction, this is where we bring stuff back to the midline, or we're adding it back to the midline. That's how I remember it. So that would be like taking your leg from that abducted position and putting your legs back together. That's leg adduction. I guess while we're on it, let's talk about plantar flexion and dorsiflexion. These are two specific types of flexion and extension that only happens with the ankle. So the ankle, we can press our toes down into the ground, or we can pull our toes up towards our shins. And those are kind of like both types of flexion, and we name them specifically. So plantar flexion is where you take your toes and press them into the ground, or we like stand up on your tippy toes. Plantar flexion. And remember, the bottom surface of our foot is called the plantar surface of the foot. So if you can remember that, then you can remember that plantar flexion is where you're pressing your foot down in that plantar direction. And then dorsiflexion, dorsi means the top surface. So the dorsal surface of your foot is the top surface of your foot. And if you pull your toes up towards your shin, that's going to be dorsiflexion. Let's move on from the angular movements to the more circular movements, where we're talking about like rotation around a single pivot point. Speaking of which, rotation is where we're turning something around the long axis. And so here's what I mean by that. Imagine your head has got a long axis straight down the vertebral column. We can rotate our head by simply turning our head from left to right. Like if you were to say no to someone, shake your head no, that's rotation from side to side. Circumduction is like a 360 degree movement of one part of the bone in a big, huge circle. So you imagine taking your arm at your side and rotating it out in front of you, up above you, back behind you, and then back to its original location. That's circumduction. It's almost like a lasso-like movement, sort of, where you can hold a lasso in your hand and spin it around a central point. That's exactly what circumduction is. Last but not least, let's do pronation and supination. We might already be familiar with these, but pronation and supination are unique movements of just the forearm. So basically, if we look at our hand, if you turn your hand so that your palm is facing upwards, that's supination in a supine position. And then pronation is where you turn the palm of your hand down or into a prone position. And the way I remember these is if you ask someone for a bowl of soup, you are going to put your hands into the supine or supinated position. So supinating your hands, turning your palms upwards like you're asking for soup. Pronation, like you're turning your forearms down. Okay, pronation, supination, got those. Did we miss any? I think we got them all. Joint movements. Okay, I think that's it for us here. Nice short episode for us, and I will see us all soon.